Someone we didn't know tried to pick up Dylan from school today, said his elementary school teacher. The guy said that he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have an older brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspect something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall, lanky guy, black hair. Looked to be in his late 30s, maybe even 40. Who knew your address, though? Dylan's full name, his birthday, and what class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal, and when I came back out, the guy was gone. I was silent for a second, as I stood there facing the teacher outside of the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and a basketball court leading into the school. All the other kids and parents had left, and we were the only ones standing outside. Well, where is Dylan now? I asked. He's waiting for you in the principal's office, she said, gesturing for me to follow her inside as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her, very shakily. Then, through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son Dylan had sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk, and there was a cop standing next to her. Hey, buddy, I said. You okay? Dylan looked up at me blankly. My Dylan was a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad. My late wife, Angie, Dylan's mother, died about a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend. They never identified who the driver was. I won't go into any more detail here because, frankly, I'd rather not relive that period. But safe to say, it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? I guess only God knows, right? I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school, but after assessments, they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy. He preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed that I was Dylan's dad, and then he asked me a few questions. He finally told us that they'd find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things. To be honest, it was all a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you? Asked the principal, and Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. I mean, Dylan was my whole world, all the family that I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. I mean, who was this bastard? Why my son? Did he know us, or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter, and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem to be rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked, and at the time, I just thought that he was timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later, after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said that one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. And when Dylan was asked about it, he said that he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl, who apparently spotted him, was questioned further, and she was adamant that she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found no one suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. Look, I won't get angry. I just need you to tell me the truth, I said, trying to steady my nerves. Did you, or didn't you, talk to a stranger today at school? Yes or no? He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son? He nodded, looking slightly afraid, and I realized that I had raised my voice, and I felt guilty immediately. Exacerbated and running on about 2 hours of sleep, I left him in the dining room, and I went straight to bed. That night, I woke up at around 2 a.m., and I went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it, but he wasn't in his room. I called out his name. I looked around in the living room, the kitchen, getting more frantic as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even cupboards, which made no sense to look in as he would never fit in them, but I was desperate. I was thinking that he'd been kidnapped. I went out into the streets and I was yelling his name as I ran up and down the block like a maniac, but to no avail. And as I came back into the house ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room one last time. And there he was, sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved, but still alarmed. I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you, and you weren't in here." "But I was." Had I imagined all that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. "Just stay in your room, okay? Don't scare me." I thought that my eyes had deceived me somehow, and that the paranoia was getting to me. Perhaps I should have paid better attention to the fact that the window in his room was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock on my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments, and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would go downstairs. So this meant that it was likely an upstairs or downstairs neighbor who needed something. I had a few of their numbers on my phone for when we moved in, for contact should we ever need, but we weren't really all that close. I wonder what could be the problem. I walked up to the door and looked outside the peephole. There was no one there. Odd. I thought perhaps I had heard something. Those random occurrences were commonplace now, and second-guessing myself was just second nature to me at that point. As I walked back to my desk in the living room, I heard another knock. Something was up. I walked up to the door again, seeing no one through the peephole. Was someone, pranking us? I stood just behind the door and I texted my upstairs neighbor, asking him if he had knocked on the door. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps upstairs that went in the direction of the door and then hurriedly back to the apartment. I then received a text back about a minute later. "Do not open the door. There's a guy with a huge knife crouching and hiding right next to your door." My phone buzzed again. Another text from my upstairs neighbor. "Calling cops right now. Stay inside." I froze as all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was paralyzed for a few seconds. But when I came back to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. "Stay inside and keep quiet," I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat dripping down from my forehead. I've never felt my heart beat so fast. Dylan looked up and he raised his eyebrows as I shut his door slowly and stood outside it. It felt like I was about to throw up and shit myself at the same time. We were so still that I could make out a quiet but frantic talking upstairs, and even more rushing footsteps. I read my upstairs neighbor's text again, just to make sure that my eyes hadn't deceived me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and I grabbed one of my own kitchen knives, and then I returned to the same spot outside of Dylan's room, anticipating some crazed psycho busting down the door at any second. I chanted a manic prayer in my head for safety on repeat, but not a sound came from inside his room. And after what seemed like years, I heard sirens in the distance, and my heart started to race a little. My grip on the knife had loosened. Eventually, I heard some shouting, even more footsteps, banging, and then it all gradually faded in volume.
"This is the police!"
shouted a voice. I looked through the peephole to confirm that it was a cop, and then I opened the door, knife still in hand. They were very reassuring, actually, and informed us that a tall, lanky man with black hair had just been apprehended and taken into police custody. He had knocked on my door and was waiting for someone inside to open it. He was, indeed, waiting with a freshly sharpened knife. What he was going to do with it, to the first person who opened that door, which was going to be me? Well, if it isn't obvious, then your guess is as good as mine. The guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address, even traveling between states and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough search, though, it turns out he'd been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state, and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone, but these unfortunate things happen. Side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never really left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors, but never lived to tell the tale. So I looked on the bright side, and I counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. Sicko was in jail, and, well, I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to that story that I only just uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the very first time. He'd grown into a tall kid with a surprising number of friends, still obedient but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. Dylan's Diary, said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially, and I saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He'd always been a boy of a few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading from the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. I'll ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages. The first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed with a few doodles. But then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad have to talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox. And he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned the page. Page 22. I saw Greg today. He says that he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flipped through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg that I could find. I started to sweat, but I continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. I need Dad gone, but I was almost caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that old stupid mole rat, kept asking me about it. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. I need to be more careful. A few blank pages, with a few in between filled with scribbles and admin-type notes to self. And then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined with 2 drawings underneath. The first was a stick figure kneeling by the door, holding what looked like a dagger. The stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle. It was about to open the door. The second was the first stick figure stabbing the stick man who had just opened the door. His eyes were now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said it was good and that he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's gonna get some tools from his house. Close one. Page 43. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Ugh, why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong, and I don't know why. Page 44. Ugh, I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times, and I pondered what I should do. I never even thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. I was confused and upset. I acted as if nothing had happened for the next few days, but on the day that he was due to leave for college, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and I hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No? Why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the color drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything. Don't worry. You know I love you very much, son. You were a minor, and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just want to know what I did wrong at the time to lead you to this, and we can put it behind us." His shock expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. "You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mom." I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, and I stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile, and our eyes met. We stood in silence for a few seconds. "Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks," I began tactfully, "would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside?" "Yeah." He didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and he walked down the street. That was 2 years ago now. I never forgave him. Every night I still lie awake, thinking whether he was born that way or if it was somehow my fault. We haven't talked since he left that day, and he hasn't come back home. He's never tried to contact me, and I haven't likewise. Looks like he's doing well in college from his Facebook posts. He seems to have a lot of friends, so I assume he got his own place or stays with one of them. I wonder if any of them will ever find out who he really is. I wouldn't blame them if they never do. After all, I still don't know who my son is, and I raised him for 18 years.